everybody hear me? Brian Zimmerman, I'm the CIA out of TrueAllele. I was one of the few people that worked on the Dr. Yelnick through the Foley case. And I want to just go over as quickly as I possibly can. There's nothing more quick about the case, but how it developed into pretty much primarily a circumstantial case into given some real solid physical evidence after Dr. Carlos was brought in on it. So it occurred in April of 2006. Dr. Yelnick was found victim of homicide in his home in Blairsville Borough in Indiana County, on the southern side of Indiana County. Leading up to this, Dr. Yelnick was going through a very bitter, nasty divorce. I believe he was married for about 4 years to his wife, Michelle. Michelle had previously been married. She had 2 children. When they did get married, Dr. Yelnick treated the children as his own. In addition, during the course of the marriage, they adopted a child from Russia. So once the separation occurred, Dr. Yelnick underwent defending himself for physical abuse allegations against his adopted son, sexual abuse allegations against his son. There was PFA violations that were filed against him. All of those eventually unfounded, no charges filed. There was an instance at the Indiana County Courthouse after a custody hearing. The judge ruled in favor of Dr. Yelnick. Dr. Yelnick stood up and gave a Kramer like that. And because of that action, there was a charge of terroristic threat filed against him. Not a charge, an investigation was launched against him in reference to that. No charges, but this is the thing that was going on throughout the course of the separation. There was significant amounts of assets associated with the marriage that they were trying to have equally distributed. At a point, I believe it was April 7th, 2006, Michelle finally signed the divorce papers. Dr. Yelnick made arrangements with his cousin to be a witness to sign the divorce papers himself, April 13th, which happened to be the day that he was discovered. He was found in the living room of his house. There were photographs, documents of the divorce and the proceedings shown all about the house. It was a very bloody scene. The entryway, the front door, the side panel windows that were broken, glass was broken there, was strewn about the exterior of the house. There was blood along those panels as well, and blood everywhere. There was obviously a violent struggle there, but what we did, our forensic services unit did an excellent job. They lifted some shoe print evidence in and around the victim's body, on some documentation, and on the wood floor, linoleum floor, leading out the rear of the evidence. Those photographs were eventually sent to the FBI. They were able to identify those footprints as being made by either an A6 gel cream or gel cream plus. And they gave, I believe, that the size was 10 to 12 and a half. At a certain point, we determined and actually had an invoice from A6 where Kevin Foley at one point had purchased the size within the gel cream plus within that size frame. Size, I think it was 10 and a half. That he at one point had those shoes shipped to him. At the time of this divorce and the separation, Kevin was actually living with Michelle in a home in just outside Indiana, and in April this occurred. The morning that he was discovered, the Blairsville Borough Police Department held on to the case for about 3 months. The very morning it occurred, they sent one of their officers to Kevin and Michelle's residence. Technically, Michelle was still the husband or the wife. She was next of kin. They went there with the coroner to make notification. The officer that went with the coroner noticed and thankfully documented that she noticed like an abrasion scratch just above Kevin's left eye. That documentation that she made was just basically made a little notation on like an anatomic type drawing of the face. Eventually was entered into evidence at trial. There were some co-workers that worked at the Indiana barracks as a trooper in the crime room. That morning following the incident, the discovery, Kevin was noticed by a number of co-workers of having that little scratch. A few mentions, asked, inquired where that come from. He gave 2 different explanations. One was that he was on a pickup FOP hockey team. He was playing hockey the previous night. He had his equipment in the back of his Ford Explorer. When he tried to get his hockey stick out, he poked himself in the head and scratched his eye. Another explanation he gave was that he was in his vehicle and he was hit in the face with a seatbelt. So, circumstantially there, we're building. Additionally, in reference to that hockey team, Kevin lived in Indiana, which is pretty much centralized in Indiana County. The dentist lived in Blairsville. Route 22 runs east-west, pretty much right through Blairsville, and then you hit 119 and go north into Indiana. Kevin played at Center Ice Arena, this hockey game, in Belmont, which is on west on 22. Typically, you're going to travel from Belmont to Indiana by going right through Blairsville. All of his co-players, teammates on the hockey team, we interviewed them all. They indicated nobody knew of Kevin being injured that night in the hockey game. And the game pretty much wrapped up at about midnight. So Kevin's route of travel, right past and through Blairsville up to home, would be the typical normal route. We gathered surveillance footage from the local convenience stores. We discovered a vehicle similar to, but even through video enhancement, could not be identified as Kevin's. It was on 2 different locations. One was at a convenience store in New Alexandria, which is just prior to going into Blairsville. That was about 12:20 in the morning. And we also have one which 3 or 4 blocks away from the residence, where we see a vehicle coming up from the residence of the victim, turning and headed towards Indiana. That one was in around 1:20, 1:30 in the morning. So there's about an hour time frame where it would have only been maybe 15 minutes to get from one to the other. And the one in Blairsville itself would not be the typical route that Kevin would have used to travel from the rink to his house. The state police we took the case on, and it was July. This occurred in April. We went out and we did a neighborhood canvass for the first time 3 months later. So we came up with a total of 7 witnesses that had heard something, an argument, screaming, glass breaking, dogs barking. 5 of those 7 were pretty much, it was lumped in between 1 and 2 in the morning. So we had a lot of activity at that time to fit into our surveillance video as far as seeing that vehicle leaving, well, not only leaving, but coming into the area at that critical time period. So we are going on with this investigation. We actually have an assessment in Harrisburg with a few of the CIAs. We discussed more and more of what we can do and so forth. Eventually we do a search warrant on Kevin and Michelle's residence. That was in October of '06. Still about 6 months after the crime itself. What we did or did not find in the house was significant. First thing was an invoice from a local carpet cleaning business that it was documentation that it was approximately 2 weeks after the homicide. Michelle's name on the invoice wanted her entire house, all the carpets cleaned. We go to this business and they say, we've never dealt with Michelle before, this was the very first time. We also did not find any of Kevin's hockey equipment. He had years ago purchased a complete hockey bag with all of his equipment. The FOP team, they had very distinct sweaters, one black and one white. They all had their own numbers, and to this day, his equipment has not been discovered. Some of the other circumstantial stuff that we had were that Kevin's co-workers at the barracks described him to frequently flick open, play with a pocket knife, to the extent where one of the actual troopers was actually had his trousers cut by Kevin as he was playing with a knife. Kevin also was, some of the other troopers said Kevin was actually heard and actually approached, making threats. You know, I hate this guy, I wish he was dead, you want to help me kill him, all based upon these allegations of the sexual assaults, physical assaults. Dr. Yelnick's divorce attorney we spoke to at length. Significant in that conversation was that Dr. Yelnick says, look, I'm fearful that Kevin's going to kill me. I want to give you money to put in a fund to ensure that this death is properly investigated. He's a trooper. I don't trust that it will be investigated properly. So we have all these items. We eventually, just about the time we're starting to put the case to a grand jury, we submit the victim's fingernails to the FBI lab. We're going through the grand jury, and we get results back from the FBI that we find the probability at the 1 in 13,000 chances of randomly selecting someone with that matching the blood and the DNA. So we get at that point, we read that into the grand jury, we get the approval to file the charges, and Mr. Anthony Krastik from the Attorney General's office, he reaches out to Dr. Robin Cotton as well as Dr. Carlin, and eventually we get the numbers. Dr. Cotton was 1 in 7 million?
23.
23 million. And yours was 17 trillion?
189 billion.
Okay. So we have those numbers, which were obviously very, very helpful with the trial. Eventually, Kevin went through the trial, and we got a first-degree murder. So I will let Dr. Carlin at this point explain the rest of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to focus on the DNA evidence. This is Blairsville dentist John Jelinek and Michelle, his wife at the time. This is Dr. Jelinek as a murder victim. Here is a lot of blood all over the floor. This is glass that's left by a window pane by the door. And Tony Krastik, who's the Attorney General who prosecuted the case, talks about the mailbox that was over here and how there's a window pane with broken glass on the floor and blood streaming down from where Dr. Jelinek's head was put through and his neck was severed, and how the postman delivered the mail, walked over the glass, saw the blood, and went on to continue to deliver the mail, which is an interesting fact of the case. So Kevin Foley was arrested. This is the DNA fingernail evidence. Those are the fingernails. Clippings were taken from the fingernails, and it was a mixture that was 93% of the victim, Dr. Jelinek, and 7% of some other DNA component. And that's the right way of looking at it. When you get started, it's whatever you know, and then there are unknown components. The question is, how do they match and with what strength? So, as Brian mentioned, there were 3 different DNA match statistics. The inclusion method, which is the CPI, combined probability of inclusion, that I've been talking about, that uses a threshold and no other information from the peaks except whether they're in or out, had a match statistic of 13,000 from the FBI. Robin Cotton's method subtracted out the victim and accounted for Dr. Jelinek's DNA, and that produced the statistic of 23 million. And then the TrueAllele computer system works not by including or subtracting, but as you saw, by adding together alleles and genotypes, and that produced the statistic of 189 billion. So some questions that might occur to you is, why are the different match statistics? How do mixture interpretation methods differ? And how do you present all this in court? So I'm going to take you through some of the science, and then through the admissibility hearing and through the trial and the outcome. This is data from one of the 13 coded loci. It's on chromosome 7. It's called D7. You see 2 tall peaks. They correspond to the victim, and 2 short peaks that correspond to someone else. The victim's peaks are an 8 and a 12, and these other peaks that belong to someone else are a 10 and a 13. And from what you learned an hour ago, you can look at this and say, well, it looks reasonable that there's a strong differentiation between a 93% contributor with an 8 and a 12 as the major victim's genotype, and there's probably somebody else in there with a 10 and a 13. And you'll see that that intuition that you have is something that the computer will agree with you on. So this is, in a nutshell, how TrueAllele works. It adds together these genotypes. Now, because these genotypes, these alleles in the genotypes are all different, they're not going to add up and stack on top of each other. They're just going to be separate, which makes it simpler to see. So there's the victim genotype, and there is another genotype, maybe a 10 and a 13, and there's a genotype pattern. And the computer generates thousands of these different patterns and compares them with the data. And you see a pretty good comparison between that 8 and 12 as the victim's peaks, and the 10 and the 13 in orange as peaks belonging to someone else. So that's the first step, which is to infer the genotype. And in fact, the pattern is so clear, the computer infers this with virtually 100% probability. And how does TrueAllele preserve the information? Well, at the suspect's genotype, which is that minor contributor of that 813 in orange, it looks at that 100%. It says, well, that's just what it is. It's an 8 and a 13. But how rare is that in the population? Well, it's between 1 and 2%. So there's a ratio of 58, which is the perfect match divided by the rarity in the population. And that matching the genotype in the step 2 because there's a high probability of 100% that the computers infer the genotype with, preserves the match information. The number's over 50. There's a lot of information there. How does the inclusion method work? Well, not as well. It works by cutting a line through the data, as you see here. There's an 8, a 10, 12, and a 13. And it's not looking at a tall pair of peaks and a short set of peaks. Instead, it reduces the data to saying, well, we know that there's an 8, a 10, a 12, and a 13 in there, and they're all treated the same. And if you look at the different combinations of those, you can have an 8 and an 8, and an 8 and a 10, and an 8 and a 12, and an 8 and a 13. There are 10 different pairings. So if you're not using the pattern, and you're not using the peak heights, but you treat them as all the same, you can visually see you're losing a lot of information. The pattern of the DNA evidence is gone. So they apply a threshold, discard the peak data, and they make these peaks all the same. There are 10 possible pairings, like an 8-10, an 8-12, and so on. They have equal likelihood, and that probability that should have all been concentrated on the 10 and the 13 is now diffused over 10 different possibilities, and that diffusion loses the match strength and, in fact, lowers that numerator from 100% that it could really only be, the two small peaks as the allele pair, down to under 5%, and drops the match statistic from being over 50 to under 5. So that's how thresholds lose information. They let in a lot of possibilities that actually just can't be true, and they're given equal status. Sometimes they lose the data altogether, but in this case, you're seeing a drop of like 58 to 2.57, and so when the match is done, that lower genotype probability loses information. So this icon again with a gavel is indicating what happened at the admissibility hearing. This was the first time TrueAllele or any computer system like this had ever been used in the world, and it was introduced in this case, and as happens some of the time, I'd say maybe in 10% of the cases, there can be an admissibility challenge. And so an admissibility challenge occurs when the opposition, often the defense attorney, says, is this really reliable science? Is this something that should be admitted into evidence in our courts? And so I'm going to just give you a flavor of what we showed Judge Martin at the Indiana courthouse. First, there was the concept that the interpretation of evidence follows the same principles. We start with the same DNA data. So there are differences, but the principles are the same. Regardless of the method, genotypes are inferred. If there's a data, there's a model, there's a comparison between data and models, there are probabilities. With the inclusion method, with these thresholds, the practitioners are less aware that all this is going on, but it is there under the hood, whereas with the computer, it can be made more explicit. Then after the genotypes are inferred, matches are produced, and the genotypes are matched and compared, and a statistic called a likelihood ratio is calculated. So the interpretation is based on the same principles, infer genotypes and then match them. It's just that the human threshold methods throw out a lot of data in the process. We showed what the difference was between these three methods. In terms of the data used, the inclusion method did not use the victim profile, and it didn't use the original data with the peak heights. In terms of what Robin Cotton did, which is different from what the FBI had done, she did use the victim profile, and that made her make better use of patterns where all four alleles, two small ones from the other person and two tall ones from the victim, were present. But she still didn't use the peak heights, whereas the addition TrueAllele method used the victim profile and it used the original data. In other words, as the methods become more sophisticated, they're making more use of the same data. So it's not surprising you'd get different results if you're using more of the data. We presented a bibliography, and we showed that for the Frye standard for admissibility in Pennsylvania of general acceptance in the relevant community, that these were the principles that TrueAllele was based on: quantitative data, genotype probability distributions, how computers interpret, and so on, and that all of these methods and principles were established in literature, in science, some going back over 100 years. There was nothing that was terribly novel about TrueAllele. It was new, but it was based on long-standing principles of how to model these data and compute match statistics from them. We also showed that there was a way to validate mixture methods that was based on using the match statistic and the number of zeros, which was information of how efficacious it was, how reproducible it was, and we could show, based on data in a paper I presented in 2006 at a conference, Scientific Validation of Mixture Interpretation Methods, that it was well known in the field that TrueAllele's addition approach was more informative than subtraction or inclusion, and it was a known ranking. This wasn't novel to the case. This is more of these graphs that I don't want you to look at too much, but what each of these points represents is based on how much DNA goes in to a component of a mixture, how much information comes out. Okay, so quantity of DNA in, quantity of information out. These are scales which are, again, logarithmic, meaning you're counting the number of zeros, 10, 100, 1,000, and then in terms of the match statistic, 1,000, million, billion, trillion. So 3, 6, 9, 12, and so on. And these were studies that we had done that were published later that year, where, again, you see this trend. Here's the line, that as the amount of DNA of a component of a mixture increases, there are more molecules that are present, so the quantity of DNA increases, the amount of information goes up as well until you saturate the system because you've reached all the information you can possibly get. Well, these validation studies are good for figuring out what happens in a case. A question that the defense attorneys came back to was, this is not an expected result, is it? The answer should be, for a mixture, it should be in the millions. If it's our DNA, isn't DNA always in the gazillions? Isn't that what we expect? And we said, no. We actually knew that there were 6.7 picograms of DNA from the mixture proportion and what the FBI had quantitated. We knew that with 15 loci, the statistic would be around a trillion. Only 12 were used. The statistic was around a trillion, a little bit under. And so the actual result was in the neighborhood of what we would expect. And that's a powerful argument. If it's being argued that you're not getting what anybody would expect, you say, no, science says for that amount of DNA, that's the match statistic that you would get. That's very meaningful. We'd also done studies which we showed the judge during the admissibility hearing that compared the amount of information from TrueAllele, which is an addition method, to the inclusion method. And what you're seeing, you can see it in different ways, is there's a shifting of this blue line over to this red line with inclusion. What's really going on is that all these points up here are dropping down. You're losing a tremendous amount of information, and when you go to lower amounts of DNA that are low template, below 100 picograms, that you lose the information completely. So the human methods can handle the easy mixtures, as you see by all these blue dots dropping down into the red, but they can't handle smaller amounts of DNA. And this was known. We just quantified it and published it. Then there was the question of thresholds. And this was interesting. So you could ask the question, why would anybody use a threshold? Many of you ask yourselves that question, we do. But you could also ask the question of what's the difference between using a threshold and not? Well, here's a picture of a person. You could see he's a young man. It's in black and white. Think of it as a grayscale image. You set the threshold to some level, and now it's all black and white. Either the pixel is there or the pixel isn't there. It's black and white. And you see the loss of information relative to the grayscale image of Jimmy Stewart from the movie A Wonderful Life, which the judge knew because the Jimmy Stewart Museum was right next to the courthouse in Indiana County. And what thresholds do is they take information-rich data and they get rid of it. That's what thresholds do. So we use and most computer systems use quantitative data for various shades of gray. We also talked about discussion in the community of articles that have been published about these inclusion methods versus likelihood ratios, which TrueAllele uses, that has more information. And these are famous statisticians who'd written articles saying that inclusion often robs items of probative value. That was Bruce Weir. Charles Brenner says that these thresholds and inclusion usually discards a lot of information compared to the correct likelihood approach. You should know that in 2006, that was a very bold statement to make. Correct as opposed to, it's more accepted now, but Mike Krowitz says very neutral way, diplomatically, that the inclusion methods don't use as much of the information included in the data as the likelihood ratio approach. Conceptually, they're the same, though in practice they're not. And there was a recommendation from an international paper in 2006 that likelihood ratios, which is using more of the data, is preferred when you're in over-inclusion to when you're interpreting mixtures. We also defined the Tony Krastik defined the relevant scientific community. This is important. If you have 10,000 crime lab practitioners and they're all using inclusion, doesn't that mean that it's generally accepted? Well, not really, because the relevant scientific community are those scientists who develop these methods, who test them, who publish, present them, implement them in software, and provide these methods for practitioners to use and lay the scientific foundation. And in this sense, there are maybe 50, at most 100 people in the world who were the relevant scientific community for the science behind DNA interpretation. And in that community, inclusion and thresholds was not viewed upon terribly favorably. Christine Tomsey, who was director of the Forensic DNA Laboratory at the Pennsylvania State Police in Greensburg, had published a paper in 2001 talking about mixtures and known contributors, saying that you can infer the genetic profile of the unknown contributor. It's okay to subtract out a known contributor, and that p-kite ratios could be used. All of which shows that even though the lab was using thresholds, they did acknowledge that there was more information in the data that could also be used. There was also a really powerful study conducted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in 2005 by John Butler and his group in the Applied Genetics group. This was never published. It should have been, but it was never published. What they did is they looked at over 50 laboratories. They sent out data and said, why don't you analyze these data using the methods you have, well, all of which are various threshold methods. And what they found on the same two-person mixture with a known victim, asking what is the match statistic for the unknown contributor, the numbers varied from 4 zeros in the thousands, where most of the answers were, to up to 14 zeros in the hundreds of trillions. In other words, there was no consensus in the community with thresholds about getting the right answer. It varied over 10 zeros, right? A factor of 10 billion when people gave answers. Other people said there was no answer at all. And so I left that out. But again, as this is John Butler's slide from NIST, remember, these labs are interpreting the same pictures, the same data, and their answers are all over the map. This study was repeated in the Mix 13 study that was presented 2 months ago at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences meeting. And they thought that by having 2 thresholds, the results would be phenomenally more consistent. Guess what? They weren't. In fact, they said they were quite surprised that introducing stochastic thresholds did not improve concordance at all throughout the U.S. crime lab community. And there, I think they had over 100 participants. So the interpretation is known to differ even with the same method across different laboratories. This is just a pretty picture, instead of showing math equations, that show that at the time, other people were also using the same type of search, the same type of methods, and publishing their articles. So TrueAllele wasn't living in a vacuum. Other recognized scientists around the world were building similar software. These were a list of users at the time who'd used part or all of the system. I should mention that the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner had retained, I won't talk about it today, but had retained cybergenetics to reanalyze all of their DNA data, their STR data, from the World Trade Center mass disaster, which involved over 18,000 victim remains and 2,700 missing persons. And we actually built our first little supercomputer on this project with maybe 20 to 30 processors, and interpreted all that data and separately and then as genotypes, and had the computer connect them back together. And the validation studies we had done on 150 items showed that the computer produced concordant results with what they had expected. There were other software systems around at the time. This list keeps changing. Most of them go away after a while, and then people create other ones. But again, this wasn't in a vacuum. People regularly develop software to solve these problems, and TrueAllele could be viewed as maybe the most sophisticated, but just one of a number of software systems. Okay, so on cross-examination, the sort of questions that came up were, how can reliable DNA give different statistics? Well, you've seen enough that you could answer that question now, right? If you make different use of the data, you're going to get different statistics. We didn't spend much time on the fact that even on the same method will give different results if it's human review. Why doesn't the computer use thresholds? Because it doesn't have to. As you heard, it doesn't have to. In fact, what the computer can do with a lot of calculation is it can work out the uncertainty and range of certainty of every peak in the data. It takes a lot of time for it to do it, which is why it can take hours and days instead of seconds. But the threshold is trying to give you some one-size-fits-all level of certainty that's not working. What a modern computation can do for thousands of different problems in different fields is to say, if I see a certain peak with a certain height in this pattern, what is the range of peaks I would expect if I repeated the experiment? It works out the uncertainty from the data, which is what modern 21st century statistics can do. Has this method ever been used before in court? At the time, no. Now, that's not a basis for admissibility, but it was a fact. It had never been used before in court. The judge didn't care about that, and Judge Martin admitted TrueAllele into evidence, and then we were able to proceed with the trial. Again, this is the first time any statistical method like this that inferred genotypes and matched them was ever admitted into a court of law. Okay, the trial testimony focused on direct exam on these aspects, but there's one principle in mixture interpretation and DNA evidence, which is you infer genotypes and then you match them. That the methods make different use of the same data. We're not changing the data, it comes off the machines, but different aspects of it are used. There's the concept that better use of the data will give you more identification information. If you use all of the evidence instead of only 10% of it, you'll probably reach a better conclusion. We talked about the Mix-05 study done by the federal government, that there's a huge amount of variation in interpretation using thresholds. And in fact, for some groups, like New York State, who's bringing TrueAllele on board now, we just trained, I think, the 40th student. They have about 60 processors. They're all set to go. Lots of validation studies done. We published a validation study, our second one, with them in November in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, and a key motivation was consistency in interpretation. When the labs have two different people following the same protocol coming up with vastly different numbers, they'd rather use computers where the computer will reliably give you the same numbers and work consistently. And then we also showed that the results were not unexpected. The scientific validation studies that we had done predicted what the range of the match result, and there was nothing unexpected about it. I walked into the courtroom with about, if you're old enough to remember the song Alice's Restaurant by Arlo Guthrie, with 57 color glossy photographs with circles and arrows on the back of each one explaining what it was. Some of you remember that. Most of you are too young. Tony Krastik said, I like those 4. So I'll show you the 4 that he chose. But that was it. I didn't get to use the other 53. And what he wanted to show was to the jury that there was a natural progression of statistics. There were really no surprises. So I'll show you what this is. On this axis, we have the match statistic, the likelihood ratio. And here we list the 13 different locations, the different loci. And this is how the FBI arrived at the number of 13,000. Whenever you see a number of 1, it means the locus isn't being used. And these are the numbers, so the scales 10, 20, 30, and so on, that were found at each locus. And when you multiply the heights of those numbers together, you get 13,000. So that's the starting point for this investigation from the FBI. What Robin Cotton did with her subtraction method is she recognized that at 2 loci, D7 and Pho1, this is now shown in orange, that instead of having alleles that were on top of each other, which human review can't do very much with, that in the 2 cases where they were all 4 separate alleles, 2 big ones and 2 little ones like we saw before, she was able to get a lot more match information from those 2 loci. And that little bit of extra information increased her number from 4 zeros after the 1 to 7. It went up from tens of thousands to tens of millions. It's not magic. She got more information by using the victim at 2 loci, and that's what produced that change. What the computer did is that whatever Robin's method using the victim, the computer also got more information out of those locations, but because the computer doesn't care as much about overlapping alleles, mathematically, it can account for the fact that there are 3 and they're added together. It's an addition method. It doesn't care. We had written papers about this almost 15 years ago. It was able to get the same information as the other methods, but a little bit more at some other locations. And that little bit more translated into a few more zeros after the 1, going from 7 zeros to 11 zeros, up to about in the hundreds of billions. And so what the jury could see is that as more use of the data was being made, more match information was emerging from these different loci. Moreover, it wasn't perfect information. In white, that's what would happen if the computer just said, imagine it's single source data and it's perfect. Well, the computer never got that far because the information wasn't in the data. It never got out to the full statistic to Kevin Foley of 14 zeros. It stopped because it could only make 11 zeros use out of the data in forming a match statistic. On cross-examination, the sort of questions again were, why are there different statistics? And the answers are how the methods of interpreting mixture evidence use data. Shouldn't the same data give the same answer? No, and I gave a microscope analogy. I'll show in the next slide. And don't computers need thresholds? The answer is no. That's a human limitation. The mathematics with computers in the last 50 years has gotten much more sophisticated, and they can work out the range of confidences for the data without trying a one-size-fits-all approach in much more sophisticated ways. So this was the microscope metaphor. To answer the question about if it's the same data, shouldn't you always see the same results? I said the less informative methods ignored some of the data, while the TrueAllele computation considered all of the available data. And referring to a microscope as an analogy, I said a scientist may look at the same microscope slide using the naked eye or a magnifying glass or a microscope, and a computer that considers all the data is just a more powerful DNA microscope. I was asked on cross-exam, did I use a microscope? And I said, no, I was using a computer. That was just a metaphor. So the jury deliberated for, I think, about an evening, and then they convicted Kevin Foley of killing John Jelinek. And Tony's Krastic quote, the prosecutor, was interesting. He said, "John Jelinek provided the most eloquent and poignant evidence in this case. He managed to reach out and scratch his assailant, which captured the murderer's DNA under his fingernails." The Foley lawyers appealed, and that was good because that led to a precedent, and then the state attorney general's office asked them to publish this, and in February of 2012, Pennsylvania received a published precedent establishing TrueAllele as a reliable method in the state of Pennsylvania that could be used in court. That actually led to more use of TrueAllele. We'd had 3 cases waiting in Allegheny County, and this precedent appeared about a month before the first trial. So even though the district attorney's office was all set to go forward with a Fry hearing, they didn't need to. And then at the same time, or around the same time, as we used more and more of TrueAllele in the state, we began getting more requests from your departments, from the state police, to look at cases. So at this point, we've looked at, I'd say, about 18 cases in Allegheny County, maybe another 10 cases from around the state. So it's at least 25 cases. And these have been the outcomes so far. The top 5 cases have gone to trial. For Kevin Foley for homicide with fingernail evidence, Glenn Lyons, which you'll hear about after the break, with clothing, Ralph Skundrich, which was clothing and a rape, Leland Davis was a murder, that was a hat and a gun, 3-person mixtures, and Mr. Akan was a serial rapist, and there was DNA on clothing. So the outcomes of those trials were guilty. These were the sentences. And interestingly, here are the outcomes of 5 other cases. You may recognize some of your cases up here if you were involved in them. And so we have interesting outcomes of 1 year, 25 years, life, and so on, but none of these had to go to trial. Remember, with single source clear DNA, if you just have DNA and you have a match statistic, people will plead guilty. They'll get a better outcome for themselves and save the criminal justice system a lot of time and effort and resources. And that's what can happen with mixtures as well, is that 5 of them went to trial, 5 of them didn't need to go to trial. There were stipulations, guilty pleas, and so on. And as I mentioned before, there were also exonerations. So this is sort of the map of Pennsylvania right now, with about 25 to 30 cases. There are a number that are pending and ongoing with more evidence coming in, but I don't like talking about ongoing cases. Okay, so that's Kevin Foley, Pennsylvania, and so on. If you'd like, this might be a good time to take a few questions before we go into the last round, which we'll talk about the Glenn Lyons case and DNA databases.